My name's Ian Overton. I've been very honoured to ask to moderate this event. I run a charity called Action on Armed Violence, but I've been a journalist for, well, far longer than I care to admit. And I've worked in around 24 war zones around the world. And I turned that experience into a PhD in war reporting. So it's an immense honour for me to be here today, and I just wanted to sort of give some brief context before I introduce people who probably don't need much in the way of introduction. So in the past 22 months, as you know, Gaza's become the deadliest conflict for journalists in living memory. The Committee to Protect Journalists estimates that at least 197 reporters and media workers have been killed since October the 2023 in their last report, but Palestinian groups say the toll is higher, well above 250. Just last month, 5 journalists died in a double strike on Nasser Hospital, and a week before that, 4 Al Jazeera staff and 2 freelancers were killed outside Al Shifa Hospital. The CPJ called this the deadliest and most deliberate effort to kill and silence journalists it's ever documented. As you know, Israel has barred foreign reporters from entering Gaza, while simultaneously destroying much of Gaza's press corps. This has left the task of bearing witness almost entirely to Palestinian journalists. They worked under relentless bombardment and constant threat, often posthumously branded as militants, and these are claims dismissed as unsubstantiated, but effective in delegitimizing their work and obscuring potential evidence of war crimes. So I'd like to welcome to the floor Wael Al-Dadoub, Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau chief, and he embodies that reality. He's endured unimaginable personal loss. His wife, daughter, son, and 9 relatives were killed in an airstrike in Nusrat camp. Weeks later, he was injured in a missile attack that killed his colleague, Sama Abu Daka, and in January 2024, his son Hamza was also killed. Despite this, Wael continues reporting from Gaza's front line, a testament to the determination of Palestinian journalists to keep that story alive. And he's joined today with his translator, WAN-IFRA. We're also joined by John Williams, who's the executive director of the Rory Peck Trust, which supports the safety and welfare of freelance journalists worldwide. He sits on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, chairing its Journalist Assistance Committee, and he brings a global perspective on the culture of impunity that surrounds the attacks on the press. And with us is a dear friend of mine, Ramita Navai, who's an award-winning investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker who's reported fearlessly from more war zones than I can imagine. Her recent film exposed the collapse of Gaza's health system under bombardment and the targeting of medical staff, and controversially was refused to be shown by the BBC, but bravely shown by other channels. She's a former foreign correspondent for Channel 4's Unreported World and PBS Frontline, and the author of an amazing book called City of Lies, which I really recommend you read because it's a work of exquisite lyricism. So together, we have a panel who really understands the landscape of harm that we're witnessing in Gaza. And I just would like to start off with a question to Wael, saying that this doesn't seem to be just a pattern of attacks of Gazan, Palestinian journalists, but a deliberate strategy, keeping foreign correspondents out while silencing, demonizing, and ultimately killing Palestinian reporters. How have you experienced that strategy on the ground?
أولاً شكراً جزيلاً على هذه المقدمة، وشكراً لكل واحد وواحدة منكم على الحضور. وبالتأكيد هذه ليست هجمات عشوائية أبداً، بالعكس.
Thank you very much, all of you, for attending this event, and thank you, Ian, for this introduction. And undoubtedly, this has not been a random targeting of journalists.
لأننا أمام حقيقة تقول بأن هذه القائمة الطويلة من الزملاء والزميلات الذين استشهدوا لم تحدث في التاريخ.
Because we are faced with a long list of martyrs, males and females, who've been killed deliberately in a manner which is unprecedented in living memory or what history records by way of recording the history of armed conflicts.
وبالتالي من الواضح أن هناك مخطط مستقل ضمن مخططات هذه الحرب في قطاع غزة يستهدف الصحفيين والوجود الصحفي والدور الذي يؤديه الصحفيون في قطاع غزة.
This has convinced us that there has been a deliberate plan, which is part and parcel of the war plan itself, to keep journalists away, whether foreign journalists and so far as the local journalists are concerned, by an attempt to silence us, to avoid the truth of these war crimes and the crime of genocide reaching the rest of the world.
أكثر من ذلك، المتتبع لكيفية تطور الهجمات ضد الصحفيين يرى بأنها آخذة في التنامي والزيادة والتصعيد والوحشية إن صح التعبير.
And if you follow closely the events, you will come to the conclusion that there has been a steady and deliberate increase in the violence and escalation in the targeting, and what seems apparent to all of us there, that this is a deliberate attack of targeting the journalists. It's not a random side effect of a conflict.
بدأت ربما باستهداف منازل صحفيين، أسر صحفية، وأحيانا استهداف صحفيين على رأس عملهم بالقرب من الأحداث. اليوم في غضون الشهر الأخير نحن أمام استهدافات لخيم تضم صحفيين، وبالتالي استهداف مجموعات صحفية ليس أفراد.
At the beginning of the war, they used to target journalists when they were in their homes with the rest of their families. Now, and in the last month or so, we see them specifically targeting individual journalists in their places which are well known, in tents outside hospitals or other places, or targeting a group of journalists trying to do a job. It's no longer the case of some journalist getting killed because he was close enough to a battlefield or something like that. It's more of a deliberate, specific targeting of individuals and groups of journalists.
تستطيع البشرية أن تستوعب، تتفهم، أو على الأقل تشك إنه هذه الاستهدافات ممكن أن تكون عشوائية أو جانبية في واحدة من الهجمات.
Maybe so far as one of the targets that we've experienced, humanity can accept or comprehend or understand or absorb as a collateral damage, something happening on an odd occasion.
ممكن يعبر عنها الجيش عن أسفه، فتح تحقيق وما شابه.
Normally, in such circumstances, the army is concerned will declare their regret. They may announce an investigation or something of the sort.
لكن نحن أمام حالة قتل مستمرة على مدار 22-23 شهر من حرب الإبادة، آخذة في التصعيد، وصلت إلى حد أن يتبنى جيش الاحتلال مسؤولية القتل بدون خجل وبدون دفاع عن هذه حوادث القتل.
Now we are faced with a situation after 22-23 months whereby the army targeting the journalists is publicly declaring responsibility of killing a journalist. It's no longer an issue of something happening randomly or as a side effect of a conflict or collateral damage. They're publicly admitting that they specifically targeted certain individuals, journalists, due to some sort of a labeling that they've invented.
وأنا سأعيد بكم بالذاكرة إلى الوراء عندما بدأت الاستهدافات تأخذ شكلا خشنا جدا، عندما تم استهداف أسرتي على سبيل المثال.
For example, in retrospect, we'll go back to the incident where his own family was targeted.
ما الذي يريد جيش الاحتلال من أسرتي؟ لماذا يستهدف الأسرة؟
What does the army of occupation want from my own family?
ويخرج أحدهم على شاشة التلفاز بنوع من المفاخرة والتباهي أنه هدف الغارات اليوم هو أسرة مراسل الجزيرة وائل الدهر.
An army spokesman went proudly bragging on public television that they have specifically targeted the family of Wael al-Dahdour.
زوجتي شريكة العمر ماذا فعلت لجيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي؟
My wife and lifelong friend, what has she done to the occupation?
ولدي محمود الذي كان يتهيأ ليكون صحفيا ناطقا بالإنجليزية، ما الذي فعله؟
His son Mahmoud was preparing to be a journalist but working in the English language. What has he done to them?
شام التي دخلت لتوها في صفها المدرسي الأول، لو تعلمون من هي شام، ماذا فعلت؟ بماذا أضرت جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي؟
Sham, his daughter, who was just about to start school, what has she done to them?
والحفيد آدم الذي رزقت به بنتي بعد طول عناء من العمليات والطب وإلى آخره، وهو رضيع 6 أشهر، ماذا يريدون من هذا الرضيع؟
His 6-month-old infant grandson Adam, his daughter went through many years of medical treatment until she successfully became pregnant and she had him. What has he done to them?
أبناء إخوتي 5 وأمهم أطفال ذهبوا في هذه الهجمة.
5 of his nephews and nieces with their mother, they were also killed in the same attack.
لماذا؟ هذا هو السؤال الكبير والعريض والصادم الذي صعقنا جميعا كصحفيين وكبشر. لماذا يتم استهداف أسرة لصحفي فقط لأنه يقوم بواجبه المهني وفي منطقة قال عنها جيش الاحتلال بأنها آمنة؟
This is the big question. This is the question we've been all thinking about, in fact, shocked about. What have all these people done to an army of occupation? They were attacked deliberately in an area which was designated by the same army as a safe zone. What was their crime?
لكن هذا كان واضحا بأن جيش الاحتلال يريد من وراء هذه الهجمة وهذه الضربة أن يبعد الصحفيين، ليس فقط أنا، لكن من خلال هذا الثمن الباهظ والموجع يريد أن يقول للصحفيين من يتجرأ على التغطية والاستمرار في التغطية لجرائم الحرب سيكون هذا عينة من الثمن الذي يمكن أن يدفعه كل صحفي.
I think by now it has become abundantly clear to all of us that what they are doing is deliberate through targeting the families of not just me as an individual, but maybe through me and others, to send a message to all journalists that you either stop reporting the truth and stop telling the world about this genocide, this mass murder, this crimes against humanity, or otherwise you know what will happen. The same fate will befall you as what happened to the others before you.
وأنا لا أخفيكم بأنه كان تحديا هو الأصعب في حياتي. تحدي ليس سهلا أن ترى الأسرة قد تمزقت وتبعثرت، بعضها استشهد وبعضها جريح ينزف يحتاج إلى رعاية، لا يوجد دواء، لا يوجد أسرة في المستشفى. أنت كصحفي ما الذي ستفعله؟ ماذا هو قرارك الآن وأنت تريد أن تهيل عليهم التراب؟ كل هذا الأمر تحديا ليس سهلا، لكن كان لزاما أن نرد على هذا التحدي.
It was the most difficult choice, the most difficult moment, the most difficult decision of my entire life when I see all my family's babies shredded into pieces, my wife, the rest of my family, they're either killed or in desperate need of a treatment with no hospitals, no hospital beds, no one even to stop the bleeding. I have to bury them and at the same time continue my job and stand before the cameras and tell the world as a professional journalist, not just a father or a grandfather or a husband, what happened to my family.
كنت في وضع لا أحسد عليه حقيقة، لكن كنت أدرك في قرارة نفسي بأن الصحفيين الزملاء والعالم كله يترقب ماذا أنا فاعل، كيف سأتصرف أمام هذه المعاناة الإنسانية.
I was in an enviable situation, really, but ultimately I had to rise up to the challenge, not as an individual who had to go through this calamity, but there are other journalists, there are fellow journalists to whom I have a duty also. There is the humanity which has to know what's been happening. So I had to bury my dead and pick up my camera and microphone and start doing my job again.
وهذا ربما مع الأسف يدفعنا دائما كأشخاص كبشر أن نتعالى على أحزاننا وأوجاعنا الشخصية من أجل قضايا عامة تهم الجميع، وهذا مؤلم جدا 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 على الإنسان، لكن في النهاية هذا هو الرد الأبلغ والأقدر حتى على الأقل نشكل نموذجا ملهما ويرتاحهم في قبرهم.
It says, for my dead to rest in peace as a human being, not just as a journalist, I had to rise up to the ultimate challenge, and that is, despite my personal loss, despite all the suffering, we are duty bound to tell the rest of the world what happened and to protect our fellow journalists who will be in other places of conflict, because there is nothing more painful than going through what I've been through. But what is even more painful is to stand idly by the suffering of the rest of humanity and colleagues and not doing anything for them. So it's a very delicate balance between burying your own suffering, setting it aside, and setting an example for others to work for the common good of all of us as journalists.
It seems as if one of the reasons that journalists have been targeted is because of this witnessing. And that the intelligence that has been gathered, and I think it's worth noting that the UK government themselves have flown 600 spy planes over Gaza since October the 7th. And that this leads to targeting of journalists. And yet, after the event, the IDF stands up and say, some of these journalists are Hamas operatives. How does Wael respond to this slandering of his fellow journalists in death?
مع الأسف هذه أسطوانة مشروخة واتهامات مجرد تبرير لعمليات القتل والإبادة بحق الصحفيين كجزء من الإبادة في قطاع غزة.
Unfortunately and regrettably, this is a broken record we've become accustomed to hearing time and again. This is just some flimsy justification, a pretext to targeting journalists. We've learned about this a long time ago.
مع الأسف جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي في كل عملية قتل عندما يسوق مثل هذه الاتهامات في غالب الأحيان تصدر عنه روايات عدة متناقضة متضاربة وكلها لا تفتقر إلى أدنى حد من المهنية والمصداقية.
Unfortunately, the Israeli occupation army, whenever they commit a crime of this sort, a genocide, a killing, whatever, they issue lots of different statements, mostly contradictory to each other, conflicting with each other to create some sort of a narrative.
سأكون صريحا، يعني بعد قتل ولدي حمزة في غارة إسرائيلية سوق رواية، قال ابتداء بشكل أوتوماتيكي أنه قتلنا صحفيين، أطلقوا طائرة مسيرة شكلت خطرا على جيش الاحتلال، على جنود جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي في المنطقة.
When his own son Hamza was killed, immediately the Israeli army issued a statement saying that Hamza and a group of other people launched a drone which constituted a threat to the Israeli army in that area.
ثم قال بأننا قتلنا صحفيين إرهابيين
Then
يعملون مع أحد الفصائل.
later on they said we killed a group of terrorist journalists who were working for a terrorist faction.
حمزة كان قد حصل على تصريح أمني من جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي لا يعطى لغالبية سكان القطاع من أجل السفر خارج قطاع غزة للإشراف على علاج أخواته الجريحات الذين قرروا العلاج في الخارج لعدم وجود العلاج.
This came after Hamza got a security clearance from the Israeli authority, which is rarely given to any people, any of Gazan population, to travel outside Gaza to accompany his sisters who were injured in a previous attack.
وبعد أيام صحيفة واشنطن بوست على سبيل المثال عملت تحقيق وكلفت لجنة من الخبراء لتحليل المواد والوثائق والصور التي تحدث عنها جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وقالت بوضوح وبإمكانكم العودة إلى هذا التحقيق بأنه لم يوجد في تلك المنطقة حتى على بعد مسافات شاسعة جنود لجيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، ولم يوجد مسلحين فلسطينيين، ولم يشكل هؤلاء الصحفيين الذين كانوا يلتزمون بكل ما نص عليه القانون من أزياء وشارات، لم يقوموا بأي فعل يمكن أن يبرر عملية القتل.
The Washington Post, a few days after the incident, published a report, an investigative report, whereby they commissioned experts who analyzed all the relative materials, the pictures, the images, the information, whatever was necessary, and they have concluded that in that particular area there were no armed people, there was no threat to the Israeli army in a vast surrounding area in the vicinity of the incident, and these journalists, they were wearing what's internationally known as the uniform, the press sign, etc., and they constituted no threat whatsoever to anyone.
زميلنا اسماعيل الغول عندما اغتالوه وكان على رأس عمله قالوا بأنه يعمل مع حماس، لكن اسماعيل الغول نفسه كان قبلها بفترة بسيطة عندما اقتحم جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي مستشفى الشفاء ودمره، احتجز اسماعيل والطاقم أسوة بغيرهم وأسوة بمئات المواطنين، لكنه سرعان ما أطلق سراحه.
Ismail al-Ghul, another journalist who was killed some time ago, he was arrested when the Israeli army stormed a Shifa hospital, which is like the biggest hospital. They took hundreds of people, including Ismail and his crew, and they kept him in detention for some time, but then later on they released him. It was the same Ismail who was, when assassinated, Israel claimed that he was a member of Hamas.
إذا نحن أمام اتهامات أوتوماتيكية عشوائية، لم يقدم جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي دليل واحد على أي من الصحفيين الفلسطينيين. ومع الأسف يمكن أن تعودوا إلى هذا الصحفي الإسرائيلي الاستقصائي الذي قال بدون مواربة بأن جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي خصوصا في هذه الحرب أنشأ وحدة في الاستخبارات هدفها فقط البحث عن عناوين إعلامية ومؤثرة للقتل وإلصاق التهم بها جزافا للتشكيك في الرأي العام العالمي في عملية القتل بأنه إرهابي يتنكر في زي صحفي، وهذا هدف واضح.
We cannot refer to what an Israeli investigative journalist wrote about the Israeli intelligence services establishing a specific unit whose main task is to select certain individuals as journalists, well-known faces who appear before the world press, and start vilifying them, start spreading false accusations of them belonging to terrorist organizations, whatever, to create, not only to create doubt about their credibility as journalists, but later on to pave the ground for their assassination. And throughout this, the Israeli army has never produced a shred of evidence testifying to the truth of what they've been saying about all these journalists.
I think that is a useful segue into a next question for John. So last month, I did an investigation into how many times the Israelis had said, we're going to set up an investigation into an outcry. And I found 52 instances publicly reported where the IDF has said, we will now launch an investigation. In only one case had that led to actually a criminal prosecution with a sentencing which involved a reservist who was found guilty of punching Palestinian prisoners in the face while they were blindfolded. All the other cases had big claims of, we will look into this, and then a rapid segue into silence and disavowal. Now, what's your theory, John, on this sort of stalking impunity, not just its consequences for Gaza, but the wider framing of the collapsing of the rules of war?
Well, let me start by saying what an honor it is to be sat alongside Wael. I cannot believe in the history of journalism that there has been a display of such courage and commitment as the Palestinian journalists in Gaza have shown over the last 23 months. And I cannot believe that there is a journalist in Gaza who has displayed the courage and commitment that Wael has done. Shortly before October the 7th, 2 years ago, the CPJ published a report looking at, going back 22 years, looking at the deaths of 20 Palestinian journalists, all killed by the IDF. In not one case had anybody been held accountable. 22 years, nobody held accountable. And in the 22 months since October the 7th, at least 26 journalists, including Hamza, the CPJ believes have been murdered, directly targeted and murdered by Israel. There is a pattern of impunity and a pattern of the world standing by and allowing this to happen. If over the previous 22 years, the world had done something and not simply acquiesced and allowed Palestinian journalists to be bumped off one by one, then perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today. But there is also a pattern of impunity within the IDF. That the laws of war are very clear, that murdering a journalist is a war crime, and the only justification for targeting a journalist is if they are a combatant involved in battle imminently. Not even the IDF says those 26 fit that description. And yet the world continues to stand by and do nothing. And as Wael has said, this is very serious, not just for Gaza, but for all of us, because we're not the only ones watching what's going on there. Right around the world, other despots are watching what's going on. And if those who've been indicted by the International Criminal Court are not brought to justice, then other people will see that you can murder journalists and get away with it. And next year, it will be somewhere else. And before too long, every journalist will have a target on their back. And that is a direct consequence of the world standing by and doing nothing as journalists have been slaughtered in Gaza.
I'd like now to ask Ramita a question, because I think that I can't think of another time when a state has been so complicit in the killings of journalists. And yet, when an event occurs, the media, particularly the Western media, still go to the IDF for comment, as if they're credible and as if they're able to articulate truths, even though in the face of us identifying as independent investigative journalists, repeated lies from their statements. But when the BBC frames Palestinian journalists, it will always frame it in the sort of sense that they aren't at the same level as, let's say, Western journalists. Is there a kind of a double standard that's emerging here, do you think?
Oh, let's take a wild guess. Yes. But first of all, I want to put this into context, and this is important, because for those of you who don't know, yesterday, the world's leading genocide body, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, declared that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And I know that we've had genocide and Holocaust scholars, some Israeli and NGOs, some Israeli announce that this is a genocide, but this is big. This is significant. And I really hope that this also means that some BBC programmes will not be so fearful when they have guests on who use the G word, as they have been. To answer your question, I think, first of all, it's so humbling listening to Wael, and it reminds us all of how shamefully we have been covering what's been happening. And really, we have to ask ourselves as journalists, how have we been covering this unprecedented targeted killings of our Palestinian colleagues? Shamefully, not very well. There have been reports, there was the Muslim Council of Britain report, there have been council's reports that have shown us, that have been forensic in detailing how partial we have been and how shoddily we have been covering this. That's at best. At worst, I would say, and this comes on to your point, I would say that we have been, some media organizations have been endangering the lives of our Palestinian colleagues in the way they've reported their killings. And I'll explain. While already talked about this investigation done by Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham for 972 magazine that exposed the legitimization cell, whose job it is, as Wael said, to launch smear campaigns, orchestrate smear campaigns against Palestinian journalists and identify journalists it can present as Hamas operatives. And there are countless examples of them doing this. And there's a pattern. It does this, as Wael said, in order to justify its subsequent killing of them because it then kills them. And you see this pattern over and over. And actually, one of Wael's colleagues, Anas al-Sharif, saw that he was a victim of one of these smear campaigns, said to the world, I'm scared Israel is going to kill me. A UN special rapporteur even said to the world, listen, she saw the pattern, I think Israel is going to kill him, and Israel killed him. Right? Now, the next step, as Wael said, is Israel, and this is all related to the point I'm going to make about how journalists deal with this. The next step is that once Israel has killed a journalist, it will then release a military statement. The Israeli military will then release a statement and, as Wael said, give so-called evidence. I say so-called because, as he rightly said, there's a long history of this evidence being exposed as fake. I'll give one example. Wael mentioned his colleague, Ismail al-Ghul, who was killed last year with his cameraman, Rami. So when the Israeli military declared him a journalist after having killed him, they provided evidence, and their evidence was documentary evidence. On this document, there were two dates. The first date was 2014, and that was the date where he had supposedly been recruited to Hamas. The second date was when he'd received his military rank, 2007, when he was just 10 years old. And as you said, John, in 2023, there was a Committee to Protect Journalists report called, was it the Pattern of Killing? Pattern of Killing. Again, and this was before October 7th. And again, it talks about these same patterns, smearing Palestinian journalists, killing them, fake evidence, right? And this is the last 20 years. So I'll get to my point. We know Israel kills witnesses to its crimes, and it's been doing this for decades. We know that. We know Israel provides fake evidence in order to justify these killings. And yet, we see some media organizations parrot these Israeli military statements as fact, without corrective, in the name of right to reply. And this is an abuse of the journalistic tactics of right to reply, because surely, as journalists, in the first place, our job is to say if and when a government is lying, not to parrot Israeli statements when we know the history of fake statements and lies. And this is, you know, you see the Israeli propaganda machine at work, from the legitimization cell to killing the journalist, and there you have, on the BBC, a news reporter reading out the legitimization cell's very justifications for killing the journalist. And something has to change. And we know it can change because, let's just take a look at how our Ukrainian colleagues are treated, right? Would Russia be given the same airtime? Would Russia be afforded the same level of right to reply? No, they wouldn't, and no, they're not. And actually, there have been respectable data journalists who have done comparative analyses on exactly this issue. And guess what? They found our media to be, I mean, you know, it doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to crack this one, our media to be partial and biased towards Israel.
I'll let John-
And
John-
sorry, just one more point. I could go on and on and on. One more point. You know, why is this? Why are Ukrainian journalists treated differently? Partly the propaganda machine, but also the answer is depressingly simple: racism and Islamophobia.
Let's have John very briefly in, and then I'll ask Wael to throw in as well.
I was just going to say that I do think the different ways in which two conflicts simultaneously have been covered is very, very important. Impartiality is values-based. It is not absolute. And when it comes to Ukraine, the Western media have labeled one side as the aggressor and the other as the country that has been invaded. That same approach has not been taken when it comes to Gaza. And I'm afraid you have to be consistent. And that lack of consistency, I think, is shaming.
So I'd like to ask Wael on the two things. The first is on the double standards we're seeing. And then the second is, what does he think could be done by the West to address these fundamental concerns?
أنا أولاً سوف أسوق هنا مثلاً لأن هذه نقطة غاية في الحساسية، وهي قضية جدلية تستخدمها إسرائيل من أجل التشكيك في عملية القتل وتبرير عملية القتل. سأتحدث عن قضية زميلتنا شيرين أبو عاقلة، يمكن لكل واحد أن يعرف هذا الاسم.
So first, I'll start with a highly sensitive and controversial issue. I'd like to draw your attention to all. And by way of an example, I mentioned our late colleague Shirin Abu Aql.
في الضفة لم يكن هناك حرب مثل ما هو الحال في غزة.
In the West Bank, there was no war like in Gaza now.
شيرين معروفة، صحفية مهنية مخضرمة، هي بنت القدس، وهي مسيحية، وهي تحمل الجنسية الأمريكية، ولا أحد يستطيع أن يشير لها بأي نوع من أنواع التشكيك.
Shirin is a well-known figure, a very well-respected journalist, highly professional. She is the daughter of Jerusalem. She is a Christian by faith. She is an American national, and nobody in the entire world can say a word, a bad word, about her integrity and professionalism.
قتلت برصاصة قناص في الرأس، كانت ترتدي الخوذة والدرع، والقناص أتى بالرصاصة أسفل الخوذة وأعلى الدرع.
She was killed by a sniper rifle. She was wearing a helmet and a flat jacket. He somehow managed to get his bullet to hit her in the neck between the helmet and the flat jacket, in the only spot where she can be targeted and killed without protection.
وهي بعيدة عن جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، بعيدة عن أي اشتباكات، بعيدة حتى عن أي تجمعات لمدنيين في تلك المنطقة، وتمشي بحذر وفق الأصول والإجراءات المتبعة، ومع ذلك أطلق عليها الرصاص.
She usually treads very carefully. She's a very professional person. She follows the textbook in everything she does. She was in a spot where there were not even other civilians, let alone armed people or the Israeli army. She was far away from the point of the engagement, the firefight, which supposedly was taking place.
أكثر من ذلك منعوا محاولة إسعافها، أطلقوا الرصاص على من أتى لإسعافها من الزملاء أو حتى من الأطقم الطبية حتى تموت.
What's even worse than that, they deliberately did not allow anybody to come to her aid, to give her first aid, neither her own colleagues, the other crews in the vicinity, and the medical crew who were trying to get there. Anyone who tried to come to her, they made sure that they will not reach her, and they let her there until she bled to death.
ولأنها محرجة في ذلك الوقت ولم يكن هناك حرب، أوتوماتيكيا تنصلوا من القضية، قالوا أن رصاصة طائشة ربما، ثم قالوا بأنه يفتح تحقيق بعد الضغط الأمريكي والرأي العام، بعد أن تحولت إلى قضية رأي عام. وحتى هذه اللحظة رغم عمليات التحقيق وتحليل الرصاصة ومكان الجريمة وإلى آخره، لم يعلن جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي صراحة أنه قتلها، وقال أن قناصا بالخطأ أطلقها، ولم يقدم اسم هذا القناص ولم يقدمه للمحكمة. أكثر من ذلك، هو تنصل من العملية عندما أدرك بأنه يمكن أن يحاكم. عملية القنص، أي واحد يدرك بأن عملية القنص تحتاج إلى قرار من قائد إلى قناص، يمر بإجراءات بعد أن تكون مجال الرؤية واضح، ويطلق الرصاص تجاه شخص معروف أو هدف معروف.
Of course, at that time there was no war like the situation in Gaza. There was no conflict in that particular area. The Israelis started by totally denying any responsibility, evading responsibility, but later on, due to some public opinion and pressure and American pressures, they announced there is an investigation. They never identified the individual who fired the bullet, although everybody knows for a fact that a sniper needs a decision from a higher command to fire after the target is identified, and he knows exactly what he is doing. They later on claimed that there was an investigation, but no individual was named. Nobody was brought before a court-martial or any normal proceedings, and until now, they're evading responsibility, and nothing has actually happened to condemn anybody for that crime.
What does he think could be done going forward to try and address these persistent failings of governance and impunity?
أولا يجب أن نقرر حقيقة واضحة بأنه نحن كصحفيين في الميدان عندما يحصل معنا كل هذه الجرائم والعالم لا يحرك ساكن، زملائنا الصحفيين، زميلاتنا من المؤسسات والاتحادات والنقابات، المنظمات الأممية والإنسانية والحقوقية لم يفعلوا شيء يرتقي يصل إلى مستوى هذه الجرائم، هذا بالنسبة لنا كان ربما يقتلنا كما تقتلنا الصواريخ والرصاص الإسرائيلي، وهو أكثر شيء موجع ومؤلم بالنسبة لنا.
First of all, what was even more painful and more devastating than the bullets and the bombs that had killed us, our realization that our colleagues, to start with our colleagues, the journalists, then the media organizations, let alone governments and human rights organizations, they did not rise up to the occasion. They did not do what they did. And this was even worse to go through as a pain and experience from the actual suffering that we suffered. And this, if we allow this to continue, it will happen to all of us, no matter where we are in the world.
And I think I'm conscious we want to have questions. So I want to bring in John, because what I'm beginning to I think we've reached is a kind of a profound existential problem here, is that impunity stalks, the rules of war have been profoundly broken. There is no, we're not seeing anyone held to account. What are your thoughts? What mechanisms, from a global perspective about protection of journalists, are not being met, and what more needs to be done?
Well, we have the mechanism. It's called the International Criminal Court. We have the rule of law, international humanitarian law. What needs to happen is it needs to be applied. And just on Wales' last point, in 2007, I had a colleague who was kidnapped in Gaza, Alan Johnson. And the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate rose up as one to support Alan and to demand his freedom. And 114 days after Alan was kidnapped, he walked out alive. It was only because of the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate that that happened. And for us to have failed to show the same solidarity with the journalists in Gaza is distressing beyond belief. The mechanisms are there. It needs courage of politicians. It needs determination. And it needs respect for the court. For a human rights lawyer who is a politician to suggest that actually it was inappropriate for the chief prosecutor to issue indictments against those who he did issue indictments against is extraordinary. Justice is blind, and the courts need to be respected, and actions must have consequences. And so we need those indictments to be followed through, and we need the families of those in Gaza deserve justice. Journalists around the world deserve protection. They will get both if actually we see accountability for what's happened in Gaza.
Ramita, we heard here the need for courage, determination and respect. You had an amazing film, and if you haven't seen Ramita's film about medics under attack in Gaza, you should. An amazing film that, for reasons I still don't really comprehend, was pulled by the BBC. Do you feel the BBC is living up to its requirement to have courage, respect and determination?
That's funny. Is that a trick question? By the way, my colleagues are here who I made it with, our brilliant director, Kareem Shah, and our brilliant exec and our boss, Ben de Peer, the former editor of Channel 4 News. It's a good thing Ben's not sitting up here, by the way, answering this question, because he's got a lot to say about this. Well, what was the question, really?
I mean, in a sense, why was the documentary pulled?
Okay.
And what does that show about wider concerns about public service broadcasting and Gaza?
Why the documentary was pulled? Well, let's look at the facts. The documentary was signed off, right? They told us this was public, a powerful documentary that had to come out in the name of public interest. And then mysteriously, all of a sudden, it was pulled. And then Ben and I were called into a meeting that the bosses didn't want me to be there for. And they said to me, Ramita, we have realized a way through this. We're going to make editorial changes. That's the only way that this will go out. And we're going to take you off it. So you're going to become a contributor. You're going to become a subject to be interviewed in the film alongside Palestinians. And they said to me, imagine that it's an episode of Who Do You Think You Are? They really did say that. Yeah. Yes. And why did they do this? Well, the BBC is clearly compromised. We know that there's a member of their editorial board called Robbie Gibb. And we know his associations with the Jewish Chronicle and what happened at the Jewish Chronicle. I won't go on now because I know our time is very limited. Right? We also know what was happening at the BBC, how fearful the BBC was and is of pro-Israel lobbyists and lobby groups who'd been named in editorial meetings. That's extraordinary for me. Never in my 22 years of reporting from dozens and dozens of countries has that ever happened. The amount of times our script was changed, that they didn't want us to use certain words. They didn't want even words attributed to experts. So Israel, when you report on Israel, you're reporting to a very different set of rules, and I've never experienced that before. So they're the reasons our film wasn't shown. Sorry, I would like to say quickly, last thing, I was talking about our responsibility and how some media outlets have been doing Israel's kind of propaganda work for it and endangering the lives of Palestinian journalists. I think special mention to the Daily Telegraph, by the way, which did more than just parrot an Israeli military statement as right to reply. It actually, you take the legitimization cell's, guidebook here. It actually ran a story smearing one of our Palestinian producers And it was a non-story, by the way. And it was a non-story saying he'd tweeted about a Palestinian militant who'd been killed. Of course, it was a retweet in his, he's a Palestinian man from Gaza when he was a teenager. There's absolutely no connection. He's a great guy. He's not Hamas. There's no connection whatsoever. It is part of the smear campaign. And the Daily Telegraph was doing that about a producer who worked for our film. Where did they get that information from? Like, who told them to do that story? Why did they do that story? And of course, that put him in absolute danger. He's still scared now because, as we all discussed, we know what happens. We've seen the pattern of what happens when there's a smear campaign. And that is exactly what the Daily Telegraph was doing itself. And it's conducted lots of these deadly smear campaigns.
I just want to say one thing as well. I did an examination of some of the BBC's reporting, and I did find Lucy Manning, who I think it's worth pointing out that she speaks regularly at North London synagogues. And she's done 37 reports about individuals who were harmed on October the 7th, 37 reports about individuals and individual reports. I haven't found any other BBC journalist being given that depth of opportunity to do stories on Gazan civilians killed since October the 7th. And I do think that there is something that's problematic about the notion of balance as it emerged from the BBC. Now, I'd like to ask the audience for questions. Please, can you, as said before, ask a question, not make a statement, and we'll take two at a time. The microphone will be passed to you.
Thank you so much for being here. There are no words to describe the shame and horror we feel at our governments and institutions' role in what you have been through. My question is, what does concrete accountability for the Western media's role in enabling this genocide look like? We saw no accountability after Iraq. We saw many journalists fail up. I have heard there are some legal remedies being explored regarding actual accountability. But what does you describe the pain of not seeing enough solidarity from some of the media, and I'm wondering what true accountability looks like for how they have laundered this genocide. Thank you, and a warm welcome to London.
So a question on true accountability, and one more. Yep, please. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, I've covered actually the Middle East since, the 90s. What's interesting is the slandering and the lack of, the slandering is so obvious, but it's never challenged. And it seems to be part of the machine to allow the slander, and if anyone is slandered, there is no the person being slandered isn't given an opportunity to respond, and this is the case that it's been a thing. The other thing is the software that's being used in our schools to teach children, Microsoft, Azure, and AI, is also being used to target people's families. How is that so right?
So
allegedly.
Yeah. So again, a notion of impunity, notion of accountability. I think, Wael, please answer that. And also, Ramita, I think also on the question of slander, I'd like to hear, because I think you've been slandered in ways quite outrageous by people in the BBC about your reporting, which has always been excellent. But Wael, please answer.
مباشرة لكي يحدث هذا الأمر نحن أمام مسؤوليات فردية ومسؤوليات جماعية.
Directly speaking, in order to have anything tangible about what you said, we are faced with two levels of responsibility, at the individual level and at the constitutional or institutional,
على المستوى الجماعي بالتأكيد سوف نصطدم بعقبات كبيرة وضغوط كبيرة وخسائر كبيرة على كل الأصعدة نظرا لانحياز المواقف في المؤسسات السياسية وحتى بعض المؤسسات الإعلامية مع الأسف والإنسانية، وهذا واضح.
At the collective level and the institutional level, it's obvious that we'll encounter many difficulties. You know, it's not easy. There's all sorts of problems that can be created, all sorts of obstacles that can be placed in our way. As for the individual level, then
لكن بالتأكيد لا يجوز ولا بأي حال من الأحوال الاستسلام إلى هذا الواقع الذي يبقينا نحن كصحفيين في مرمى النيران الإسرائيلية والصواريخ الإسرائيلية، ويبقي الزملاء والمؤسسات والعالم كله متفرجا على دمائنا.
But definitely we should not allow this situation to continue despite all these difficulties, whereby we are continue to be in the line of fire at the receiving end of Israeli bullets and missiles, whatever, and our colleagues throughout the world being intimidated and frightened and vilified or whatever, to allow this kind of impartiality to continue.
وربما هذه الرسالة الأساسية التي استطعنا نحن كصحفيين في قطاع غزة أن ننقلها للعالم. نحن بحاجة إلى صحفيين أصحاب رسالة، ليسوا فقط موظفين في أي من المؤسسات يجنون المال والمكاسب وإلى آخره. لديهم واجبات والتزامات أخلاقية تجاه شركائهم الصحفيين وإخوانهم الصحفيين وزملائهم في قطاع غزة، الذين أيضا دفعوا ثمنا باهظا ودماء من أجل قضايا استفاد منهم بشكل أو بآخر الزملاء والمجتمعات والبشرية كلها استفادت جراء ما بذلوه من جهود في قطاع غزة رغم هذه الأثمان.
And if there is one message I can convey to you on behalf of your colleagues, your brothers and sisters in Gaza, is that we do not want just professional journalists doing a job and getting paid for it and whatever. We want people with a mission, people who believe in the message, people who know they have a role to play, to serve the truth, to serve humanity, because it's not fair enough at all for us to go through that and endure all of that, and our colleagues to write about it and report it, probably even benefiting from it, you know, one way or another, and yet allow this situation to continue with all this impunity and this lack of accountability.
ولذلك لدينا كأفراد وكمؤسسات برنامج كبير يمكن القيام به. يجب أن تشعر إسرائيل وجيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بأنه لا يمكن أن يفلت من الحساب ومن المعاقبة القانونية، أو على الأقل أن يكون محاصرا بالرواية من خلال الأفراد حتى يشعر بأنه أصبح فعلا في خطر ويفكر في عملية القتل. نحن نرى استسهالا في عملية إصدار القتل أسهل من شربة الماء بالنسبة لجيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، لكنه في حقيقة الأمر يسبب فظائع ومآسي لصحفيين ليسوا أرقاما ولأسرهم وللمجتمع بشكل عام. ولذلك يمكننا أن نقوم بكثير من الإجراءات العملية التي يعني تشعر إسرائيل بأنها أصبحت فعلا في خطر على المستوى الرأي العالمي، وهنا تشعر إسرائيل بأنها منزعجة ويجب أن تعيد اعتبارها، تعيد حساباتها في سلوكها الإجرامي تجاه الصحفيين.
There is a list of things we can do collectively. Ultimately, we should all work towards making Israel feel not that they can get away with murder, literally, not they can go without any accountability, with total impunity, but to make them feel they are pressurized. There's the likelihood of them being accountable from a legal perspective, from the ICC perspective, from the world opinion, the court of public opinion in the world, because what they are doing can impact us, all of us. If we are a community of journalists, we are all members of the same family. If part of the family is dismembered or killed or something, it's only a message to others. So together we should stand up, and if we cannot make the Israelis be held accountable, at least we must pressurize them by way of challenging their narrative. not give them an easy ride that they can do what they like and get away with it by certain lies or whatever.
يمكن للأفراد بعد إذنك، يمكن للزملاء الصحفيين والمؤسسات الإعلامية أن يشاركوا في مشاركة جدية في عملية تغيير القناعات لدى المؤسسات والضغط على المؤسسات الحكومية، البرلمان، بأن تقوم بفعل ما يحقق هذا الهدف. يمكن لهم أن يقاطعوا المؤتمرات الصحفية لمسؤولين إسرائيليين يأتوا وهم قد صدر بحقهم يعني محاكم كمجرمين حرب، لكنهم يستقبلون ويحضر الزملاء هذه المؤتمرات الصحفية ويوجهوا لها الأسئلة. لماذا لا يتم مقاطعة هذه المؤتمرات حتى تشعر إسرائيل بأنها فعلا أصبحت مهددة؟
For example, when an indicted Israeli war criminal comes, say, to this country and holds a press conference, why do our colleagues just sit there and allow him a platform to speak? Why don't they walk out in protest? Why don't they show him that after all, he's not welcome? There is an accountability process, there is responsibility. And if we do that, and if we press parliaments, governments, politicians, by whatever means we can, then we can altogether change the attitude of people, change the perspective, and ultimately, hopefully, change the narrative and restore some dignity to the truth that all of us work to serve.
And Ramita, can I just throw to you and ask you about your own personal experience of
Well, do you
having
know
a
what?
documentary report?
Do you know what? This is so much bigger than my personal experience. I'll say just 2 lines on that the BBC at the time told me the reason they wanted to take me off the film was because of some tweets. I mostly retweeted human rights reports, by the way. And I later found out that the real reason, I know this from a few people in meetings, was because they were scared of the optics of an Iranian who they presumed to be Muslim reporting on Israeli war crimes. But what's happening is so much bigger. And actually, talking about accountability, I want to end by saying that there's an Israeli journalist called Orly Halpern. She's a brilliant Israeli journalist, and she's on the Foreign Association Press boards, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And she has suggested that all Western media she said, tell your media bosses to suspend all Israeli military statements and all interviews with Israeli military spokespeople, because of all the reasons we've outlined, until they protect Palestinian journalists and let journalists in. She says, otherwise, we are letting Israel control the narrative and we are all complicit. And it's hard to argue with that.
And I think on that notion of complicity, I mean, and going to your point about the technology that's using the targeting of journalists, which, I mean, we've heard of Lavender, we've heard of that terrible nicknamed system called Where's Daddy that can track the individual to their home and kill them and their family at night. I think it's worth noting that the British military has actually purchased AI weapon sites off the Israelis, and now our own military is using weapons that have been developed in the so-called Palestine laboratory. So we have 2 more questions, please. I think with the mic, one over there. And again, please, questions, not statements.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Wael. You're a massive icon in the Palestinian journalism world and the journalism world as a whole. And I wish you a speedy recovery, inshallah. My question is very simple. Why is Israel given this exceptionalism, and why is it not held to account? And actually, an additional question, what does this mean for the future of warfare if Israel is not punished for genocide, which it's committing? What does that mean? Can any country come along and destroy entire cities and wipe out journalists and wipe out families and not be held accountable as genocide? That's my question, yeah.
Thank you. One there.
Shukran Salam. Well, my question is, we work at ActionAid, and just to kind of give context to what you're speaking about with Ukraine, after October 7th, any spokesperson that we put up from Palestine, whether they were civilian or aid worker, was asked to condemn Hamas. And Ukrainians were never asked to condemn, you know, militia outfits in Crimea, for example, for what they were getting up to. So it's very clear. It would be helpful to actually have some advice from Mita about how we can push back on journalists who have asked to vet Palestinian civilians before they're allowed to even speak the truth about what's happening to them in Gaza. And actually, since your documentary, I'll just give you an indication of what it's been like for us. People won't take Palestinian civilians now onto radio programs or even to do interviews with them, to do voice notes, which is literally the voices of Palestinians speaking about what's happening to them. You can hear the drones in the background without background checking them to see if they have links to Hamas, and that's because they're scared about what happened to you with the BBC. How can we support you to push back on that? Should we just stop engaging with the BBC? Can we question them on a code of ethics? What would you advise that we do to support you in that?
Okay, so a question on precedent and a question on I guess, gatekeeping. So let's have Wael first, please.
أعتقد بأننا مباشرة أمام قضية ازدواجية المعايير القاتلة.
We are face to face now with the reality of double standards and hypocrisy in a very blatant way.
وبالتالي هذا واضح بأنه سبب كل ما نحن فيه من انحياز لإسرائيل مع الأسف وإفلات إسرائيل من العقاب.
And consequently, this explains to all of us how come Israel is acting with such impunity, lack of accountability, and getting away with any murder, genocide, or anything they do.
يعني على سبيل المثال في أوكرانيا عندما قتل أحد الزملاء الصحفيين قامت الدنيا كلها على مستوى الرؤساء والحكومات والمنظمات الأممية وحتى نقابات الصحفيين، ونحن ضد أي اعتداء على أي من الزملاء في أي مكان في العالم. لكن مطلوب أن يتم التعامل معنا نحن أيضا أسوة ببقية الزملاء في العالم، وأن يهب العالم كل العالم ويقف إنه هناك مذبحة، هناك إبادة. ليس نتحدث عن صحفي أو 2 أو 10 أو 20، نتحدث عن 247 من الزميلات والزملاء الصحفيين، عشرات الأسر، عشرات المعتقلين، بيوت دمرت، مكاتب دمرت، كل أنواع الفقد مورست علينا. ومع ذلك على العكس هناك انحياز، هناك تبني للرواية في مرحلة من المراحل.
When a colleague, an Ukrainian journalist, was killed, the whole world rose up to the occasion. Governments, heads of state, media organizations, human rights organizations. Of course, one human life is too many, one journalist's life is too many, and we fundamentally stand with them and are totally against what happens to them. But in our case, we're talking hundreds, literally hundreds of victims here. Homes destroyed, media outlets, entire buildings sometimes are reduced to rubble because there are media offices is there. But what we want is we want the world to treat us on an equal footing with our colleagues, because if what happened to them happens in individual cases, with us it's en masse. It's like mass murder to journalists taking place. So we should all make our departure point that all our lives matter and all our rights matter for that matter, and together we must try and stand up to this challenge and face it together.
قد يفكر البعض من الزملاء ومن المؤسسات بنوع من أنواع الترف، لأن هذا في منطقة نائية معزولة محاصرة يتعلق بتابو معين هو اسمه إسرائيل. لكن أنا أؤكد بأن ازدواجية المعايير سوف تضع الجميع في مرحلة من المراحل أمام نفس النتيجة، لأنه غدا سوف تتعارض مصالح هذه الشريحة المترددة أمام نفس هذه الازدواجية، وسوف يمارس عليها نفس عمليات بغض النظر عن أشكال القسوة والقمع وإلى آخره. ولذلك صحيح عندما يقف الجميع للتضامن والدفاع عن الزملاء أنه يدافع عنهم، لكنه في ذات الوقت يدافع عن نفسه، عن قيمه، عن أخلاقه، عن مصالحه، عن رسالته الإنسانية التي يحملها، التي نحن شركاء فيها.
It may occur to some that they're in a comfort zone in a remote area, they're far away from trouble, they're going on about their own lawful business, and what happens elsewhere is okay, it doesn't matter. But if we allow the situation to continue, what happens to us today can happen to the rest of us somewhere else. So in fact, all these people that we call upon to come to our aid and solidarity, for our sake now, they are not defending us. They may be defending us today, but in fact, they'll be defending themselves tomorrow, because sooner or later, even if there is an interest to be achieved by keeping silence today, there may be a conflict of interest in another conflict zone which can turn against them, and they all end up suffering, unfortunately. This is something we never wish it for anyone to go through, but they may well be suffering the way we are now.
And John, I just want to throw to you on this framing of precedent. What would you say from the Rory Peck Trust position?
Well, that it's really important that actions have consequences. People should not be able to get away with murder. It is as simple as that. And over the 80 years since the end of the Second World War, we've made gradual progress in terms of a civilized society, where in the former Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic was held accountable for the war crimes that he and his forces committed, the same in Liberia and in Sierra Leone. And the risk is that we are going backwards, and that the high watermark of human rights and of a civilized society is not in the future, it's behind us. Well, that is a terrifying prospect. And all of us should be concerned at that. I want to say one other thing, Ian, which is that there's a risk in all of this that we try to make journalists out to be a special case. Journalists are not a special case. Journalism is, because we rely on journalism to provide us with the facts that we need to make decisions, and the eyewitness journalism that provides the basis for accountability and for justice. So journalism is a special case. Journalists are not. And in answer to your question, I'm not going to talk about any individual media organization, but I am truly astonished that anybody should ask about the background of an individual, because it is irrelevant to their lived experience. And that's the answer, is that push back. Journalism is all about being brave, taking difficult decisions that aren't necessarily the most popular decisions. But you need courage to be a journalist, and we need courage now to do the right thing and to stand up for what is right. And if that means pushing back, that's what I suggest you should do.
And I think, Ramita, just to end, about sort of the amplification of the voices of people in Gaza and this gatekeeping challenge. What are your thoughts?
Can we have one more question to Wael after I'm done, so we can?
Yeah.
So I'm not the last word. I think he has to be. So to you, I would say I still believe in the BBC as an institution. It's a really important institution, and it can really do good. And there are still great journalists who work there. But yes, any journalist who is going along, who's party to Israeli propaganda and lobby groups shouldn't be doing the job. And actually, we should be saying, this is who you're going to get. And that is years of Israeli propaganda that has dehumanized Palestinians. I know this word is really overused, but it's a correct word. That's what we're seeing now. And actually, I know this because of the doctors' groups I work for. Guess what? How many times have they told me that when all the major news outlets want to interview doctors about what's happening in Gaza, they want a white doctor. They don't want a Gazan doctor who can speak perfect English and tell you exactly what's happening there. And this goes to your point, which is, this dehumanization, it's what makes me feel slightly uncomfortable about the way the calls for Western journalists to be let in is framed, not by journalists in the press, but by some politicians. It's as though we need journalists in there to tell us what's happening. No, we don't. We don't need to be there. The only function we would serve if we were there is to afford protection to our Palestinian journalists, right? What do we think will change when we're there? Nothing. There are great journalists who are in Gaza doing the work.
And I was going to just end with one question, because it's something I rarely get awestruck by meeting anybody. And I've got to say, I find it difficult to really engage with Wael because I don't know where he gets his strength from. It's almost something which is incomprehensible. And I'm just wondering how have you managed to get through this, and how do you continue? Because I think it would break me for sure.
ببساطة من الحب والإيمان والقناعة بأهمية ما نقوم به.
Simply put, is out of love, belief, and conviction of what we do as journalists.
لكن أيضا هناك أشياء أخرى بالنسبة لي كصحفي أردت أن أقول من خلال كل هذه المعاناة الشخصية بأنه نحن كصحفيين لسنا موظفين، لم نخلق، لم نأتي إلى هذه المهنة من أجل جني الأموال، وهي مقدمة وموجودة أمامنا، ولا من أجل الأضواء والشهرة فقط. هذا تحصيل حاصل، لكن لدينا أخلاق، لدينا التزامات أخلاقية وإنسانية تجاه هذه الرسالة التي كنا أمناء عليها ورسل لها على مستوى العالم كله. أين نحن من عذاب الضمير عندما نقوم فقط ونجري ونلهث وراء الأموال والأضواء ودماؤنا تسفح، دماء أهلنا؟ هناك شعب يجب أن نسلط الضوء عليه. أرادت إسرائيل التعتيم وأن يكون بقعة مظلمة ومعزولة عن العالم كله، لكن ماذا نحن فاعلون؟ ومنعوا الصحفيين الزملاء من الوصول. هذا كان من أهم الأشياء التي تسلحنا بها.
One of the most important things that, on top of what I just said, is the realization that we are not there to be doing a paid job. We're not staffers working for an organization or something. We are messengers of the truth, in service of the truth. Okay, there may be money to be made, there is limelight and fame, cameras pointing at you. Okay, that can happen. It's a mere consequence of what we do. But our job is about a mission, is about a message, is about telling the story of an entire people, a story being told in blood, in the lives of children, women, houses being destroyed, hope being destroyed. So we are there to restore some sort of dignity and humanity and hope by telling the stories of these people. We're not there to make money or to be famous or anything like that. Our work is about life and the mission and the truth of raising up to all these challenges together.
من الأشياء التي تقويني وثبتتني هي على سبيل المثال فيما حصل معي شخصيا. الأسرة أثناء عملي نظرا لإيماني العميق بهذه الرسالة وأهميتها، هم آمنوا بأهمية هذه الرسالة ودفعوا في سبيل ذلك أثمانا باهظة. لم يتواجد الأب لديهم، لم يشعروا في أوقات الخطر التي يحتاجوني فيها كأب، كموجه، كطبيب، كحنان، كقوة. لم أتواجد عندهم ببساطة لأنني أركز على رسالتي المهنية، وهم آمنوا ودفعوا من أجلها كل هذه الخسائر. من العار أنه عندما دفعوا أرواحهم أيضا ثمنا لهذه الرسالة أن أنحاز، أتراجع، أضعف، أنهزم. هذا غير موجود في قواميسنا، ولا ينبغي أن يكون موجودا في قواميس كل الزملاء.
What's even more important for me and what provided me with the strength and the ability to endure what I endured in my personal capacity is the fact that my own family shared my belief and conviction of the importance of the work and the mission and the duty I do. In fact, they suffered all their lives. I was never there as a father, as someone to look after them, to care for them, because I was out on the job. And when the moment came they paid for with their lives. You know. Sorry.
I think I just want to end. In 2023, I taught a course in storytelling in the Islamic University of Gaza for a group of students living with disabilities, and 30 of them, and 29 of them are now refugees. Their university is in rubble. And one of them, i.e. Kafifa, was killed. So Israel is not just killing journalists, but it's also killing student journalists too, even those who are living with disabilities. But I just want to ask everyone to raise their hands and thank WAN-IFRA, Wael, Ramita and John for coming today and sharing what is a profoundly painful experience, but for seeking wherever they can to shine light. Thank you.